My name's Lindsay. I am the global head of engineering at Vista Group, which is a New Zealand-based company which builds cinema software. We basically build a variety of products across the cinema suite and film. So yeah, based in New Zealand, grew up in New Zealand, born and bred, and effectively my job really entails, we have around just over 200 software engineers across the entire group. They're spread out across different regions, including Mexico, London, Cape Town, and New Zealand. And my job is to effectively orchestrate a bunch of human beings and preferably point them in the direction where we need to be heading in terms of the products that we develop and the recruitment, and make sure that all of that system works.
Well chosen words there, by effectively controlling them and preferably pointing them in the right direction. Diplomatic.
I'm still working on it.
Do you write much code yourself?
Not anymore. So the best way to say is, I dabble when I need to. In my current role, I've been in this role for the last 12 months. And this has been probably the first time where I haven't intentionally gone in and written code. It's something that I've kind of had to force myself to not do, because it's one of those things for me where I'm naturally wanting to solve problems. And so I lean on my instincts, which is you just write a thing to solve a thing. So I did right up until this role, to be honest, as in I would find myself drawn to opportunities to write code. This one's kind of pulled me away, where I've kind of intentionally avoided writing code. But I still have a very strong interest in it.
How long were you a developer for before you moved into a leadership role?
Oh boy. So I think that's going to be a tricky question, because leadership role, I guess, is a loose term. I kind of moved into team lead type roles relatively quickly. By that I mean, I would say if I did 2 for probably 6 or 7 years, and then I sort of got put into this kind of, maybe you look at running a team, that type of encouragement from management to kind of go down that path. Yeah. So I kind of got put into it relatively quickly. I mean, depends your time references on whether 7 years is quick or not, but yeah. But that was primarily like, look, when in those early stages of leadership roles, right, you're kind of working at 80-20, coding 80%, 20% just kind of managing a team. It's really just leave balances and stuff like that in those early stages.
And so just sort of like to dovetail that into the topic of today's episode, we really want to talk about like grad schemes. You and I sort of spoken briefly before about the podcast and how, kind of how it could mesh into what you're doing. So maybe you could just kind of give us a bit of an insight from your side as a little introduction, why grad schemes are a significant topic for you. And then you can add context of bootcamp grads, that would be great as well. But maybe you can.
Okay.
Maybe you can't.
Yeah. So, okay. I guess it's probably good to start off with, I failed everything in high school, right? Like I wasn't a A-class student. I had no desire to go into computers or anything like that. Well, I like the hardware side of computers. I like networking and stuff like that. And suffice to say, I was definitely the first in my immediate family to go to university. It wasn't like a trodden path, right? And so I kind of had to figure that stuff out on my own. My first year at university, I failed everything. And so it really was a push in terms of do I want to do this? And I have to really enjoy doing it. And so when it comes to grad programs, my path into software engineering was I guess not a typical university grad program. I didn't do that path, right? But what I found was, as I went through, I started it in a marketing team, and then helped build this kind of the IT department was building a map, kind of Google Maps agent, and I kind of started helping with that. And then I progressed into sort of software engineering. When it comes to grad programs, just to start with, I wasn't really exposed to grad programs properly until I moved to a company in New Zealand called Xero. Xero is now known quite around the world, and they had a really significant grad program. So that was like my first introduction to like what was a grad program, and it was significant, right? Like they would hire, 20 to 30 software engineers or graduates. They would have a very rigorous program to kind of feed that in. And they kind of sowed the seed, shall we say, around, for me, understanding the potential and what grad programs bring to organizations, because I got to see, they would explain why they do it and what benefits they offer. And they kind of really enabled these new entrants, shall we call them, into the industry, this pathway of working in what was a extremely recognizable brand of software, business in New Zealand, and really kind of paved the way for them to become excellent software engineers. So that was like my first introduction to what a grad program really was. Then when I moved from Xero into my first sort of engineering manager role in a company called Movio, they didn't have a grad program at all. And they had a very top-heavy, what I would call, development team, which was basically all senior-led sort of engineers. And I noticed there was this kind of lacking, shall we say, of that sort of junior end of the development team. And it's really, I think, was that recognition of that junior or grad level of a development team is a really, really important piece of the development puzzle. It's not just like they come in and do grunt work or do any of that kind of stuff, right? They provide so much in terms of the seniors. So, for example, when it comes to grad programs, having to explain something to anyone is actually a really healthy thing for a software engineer to do, because you become quite proficient in that skill in it itself. So grad programs offer a ton of value to a business outside of just humans. And then when it comes to boot camps, well, as I kind of mentioned in my past, I wasn't this kind of leading textbook student. And I always valued the people who would just kind of be able to do stuff. So I had this friend in high school, and he didn't do any. He was similar to me, wasn't excelling, but he could build systems, he could hack systems. He was an incredible engineer, one of the best I had known. And he had no university skills. He just learned it, right? And boot camps kind of have that flavor to it, where boot camps are often people who are super passionate. Because for me, I noticed that boot camps in New Zealand were people who might be changing career. They might be looking for alternative paths. They want practical application to certain skill sets. And the key for that one is they have to really want to do it, because in New Zealand, boot camps are quite expensive, I guess you could say, for what they are, which means you have to commit to doing it, which means that the byproduct of that is you have people who are really passionate about the thing that they've chosen to do.
Hmm.
We had a whole list of questions about how you first got exposed to graduate programs, how you think they might be different to traditional ones. And you answered all of them with that, really. You went straight through to all the way to, a lot of what you said there was great about how there are much more hands-on experience, I guess, there in terms of allowing people to actually do things, then have to explain them immediately afterwards rather than learning theory. And you are exactly right with Bootcamp. I nearly called them employees then, students. With Bootcamp students, they're always already of a certain caliber, someone who has to be very committed to do it. And I think it's very much parallel, as opposed to, when you're in high school, as you said, you failed everything because you didn't like it. You were forced to be.
Yeah. I think another point as well, which I gleaned from that, is that it's quite a good piece of advice, I think, for people who might be sort of starting their journey off into the world of technology, is that asking a question or asking for a bit of dialogue with the senior is always going to be a good thing. Just asking questions it's not a problem, and that can kind of spark the conversation, and it could even help your seniors, as you said. That kind of rubber ducking technique is so important.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think
explain rubber ducking for the listeners out there, because people are not going to know what you're saying, Tim, when you say
it. I'll hand that to you, Lindsay. You can explain that.
Look, I still use the rubber duck technique, and it's effectively, there used to be this kind of a literal, when I first got exposed to rubber ducking, there was a literal rubber duck that you would have on your desk, and it's effectively explain your problem or what you're kind of challenged with to the rubber duck. And it's effectively, as you vocalize or explore a problem, a statement or a thing that you're in, you can sometimes come to your own resolution by virtue of kind of stepping your way through it. Because by rubber ducking, you have to essentially assume they know nothing about the problem. So you have to logically tackle the problem to a rubber duck, which you typically will find the solution yourself.
The rubber duck then becomes a better engineer than you do. That's the goal.
Yeah.
Well, it's been replaced by ChatGPT now, hasn't it? Gemini, and
No, yeah.
They're the rubber ducks now.
Yeah, just put ChatGPT in the duck, and you're totally cooked. Okay, so to skip forward then into sort of diving into sort of boot camps and grad schemes specifically, are there kind of like specific hard skills that you would say that boot campers bring to grad schemes? Because I think the soft skills are kind of, maybe that's something that we've talked to a little bit more in the past around. If people are going for the roles, then they will bring a certain kind of soft skill to the role. But then technically, is there anything kind of specific qualities and skills that boot campers have that really make them stand out in a graduate program?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that, if I was to contrast the candidates, right, like, so we do graduate intakes every year. And every year you get a portion who are university trained, shall we call it, or academic in that aspect of stuff. And then you've got sort of the boot camp cohort. And there are these kind of distinct differences, I would say, between them. And both of them carry pros and to both of those situations. If I lean on distinctly towards boot camp, I would say that the pros that boot camp graduates would typically have when it comes to just hard skills is usually, based on what I've seen so far, is that the skill set that they leave with are typically matched what the market desires are. So if the market, for example, are focusing at that point in time on a particular tech stack or technology stack, be it React, be it Angular, be it now prompt engineering, whatever the industry typically needs to get a job done, a bootcamp is far more dynamic in terms of what curriculum they provide to boot campers, which means that often the pet projects or side projects that candidates are doing are in relevant technologies to the employer. And so universities will typically carry those kind of foundational technology or foundational knowledge around coding principles, how, those kind of core subject matters. Boot camps will touch on that, or this is based on just my exposure to them, but they will always carry this, like, you can leave a boot camp and get a job. That's like the statements that typically come around boot camps.
Yeah.
So in terms of the hard skills, I think the ability to match the tech stack with the company that you're hitting and hit the ground running means that you become proficient in that quick.
What advice would you give to boot campers who are thinking about then taking a graduate scheme? Is there a lot of transferable skills? I know you said already that a lot of them might have the ability to, be self-driven and stuff, but is there much of a, what can boot camps, is it more learning? Is it a lot more practical? How would you prepare them?
So in terms of boot camps applying for graduate schemes, these are all my personal, I think 100% do it. I think 100% do it. The reality is a lot of companies that will have grad programs are typically at a size where they've kind of got a full mechanism to do that. So for example, with a boot camp, you could leave and probably work in startups or quite a small company as a junior engineer or that kind of stuff. What boot camps enable is when you move into that grad system. For example, at Vista, our grad programs, my expectation of a grad is actually that they don't really produce anything at that point. They're really there to learn the domain, to become proficient. And effectively, my wording is be a sponge. In other words, your job for the first year is to ask questions and absorb everything possible. So say yes to everything and really kind of lean into this 1 year. Basically, it's the 1 year where you have this like superpower. And that superpower is you don't know anything and you're allowed to ask anyone anything. As you kind of progress through your career, you find like as a senior or as a more more senior role, there becomes this like, I don't know whether it's a stigma or something, but if you join a company, you've got like this 3-month window when you're allowed to ask questions, and then you should know everything, right? And so this grads had this like amazing luxury of being able to be like, I don't know anything you're talking about. Explain it to me.
Yeah.
Right. And the crazy thing is everyone at every level of their job should be comfortable to ask that question, but we don't.
Yeah. There's no stupid questions during onboarding.
That's right.
There's no stupid questions during your first year and onwards.
Yeah. Okay, so what kind of then, let's say I'm a boot camper and I have the ability to want to learn, but what kind of other qualities do people look for when hiring or accepting graduate program students?
Yeah. So I'll give you a really interesting story, I guess is the best way to term it, of one particular boot camp graduate who I interviewed, who was an instant yes. And we're not probably meant to say that at an interview. You've got to go through all the.
You must have been a Wagon student.
Do the due diligence, but it was one of those ones where the cool thing about boot camps is they provide a variation to what is otherwise the mass, right? So, for example, every year at the start of the year, you do a grad intake. Now, that grad intake is basically the last years of university graduates who all have the same degree and generally have done the same thing and have the same answers to the same questions, right? And then you come across these kind of other characters. And those other characters can be obviously from university, but often boot camps carry this other side of them, which makes them stand out slightly to the rest, right? And so it's quite a unique opportunity. I had one grad who took the role, and she had just come. She came in. She was covered in paint, and she had just come out of a boot camp, but she had just come off set for being the sort of costume designer for Cowboy Bebop, which is this anime movie that was being filmed at the time, right?
Wow.
And she just kind of came straight in after that.
I thought the paint thing was going to be like, like a technical term that we didn't understand. Like, covered in paint. It's like been coding the whole time.
No.
So.
Literally, she was covered in paint, and she was like, "Yeah, I've just come from being on set as a costume designer for this, for this movie. I love patterns. I love, pattern recognition, and I've found that it's able to kind of come over to software engineering, and so it was this really unique individual who was able to kind of really stand out and understand that." Tech companies, I myself anyway, right? I don't want a clone army of people who all can do the same thing and that kind of stuff, right? And so when I look at grad programs, it's an opportunity to bring in variation of personality types and skill sets and really make sure that cohort of grads themselves, if they were to all mature within that organization, that the team dynamics that they're able to provide are varied.
Yeah.
Because I could quite easily, and this does happen, go to a university and say, give me your top A students. I need 10. Yeah. Give me their names and I'll pull them into my organization. That is it.
There's such a big difference between like a hiring for like optimization and hiring to have an ecosystem and a culture. The 10 best people at writing code aren't the 10 best people to put on a team together.
That's right. Yeah,
so
totally.
Always be yourself. That's what the lesson is.
Yeah, and it's tough, right? Because I totally get like there's interview conditions. How do you be different on a piece of paper when you're submitting a CV? How do you? And there's certain limits because at the same time you don't want to go like too out there, right? So there's these kind of, I hesitate to say like stand out, be yourself, because it can be really hard to feel like I was being myself and I didn't get the job, and therefore, so it can be this. Yeah, and the reality is, it might just be that, the dynamic of what we were looking for just catered for this kind of, grouping of people, and there's a lot that actually I think it's really good to understand what's going on behind the scenes that will typically drive the candidate expectations for the grad intake for that particular year. So, for example, right now at Vista, if we were arguably looking for moving all of our on-premise products to the cloud, for example, we might look for a graduate intake that in 2 or 3 years are able to really kind of lean into that side of a tech stack, right? And so you can kind of use these grad intakes as opportunities to kind of provide strategic execution in the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's really good for like listeners that might want to go into a grad scheme to think about it. Like, you can really position yourself maybe better than you could with a job interview, because you can almost build the next few years of your career as opposed to rolling the dice, maybe.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting area, this like whole application, being yourself in an application, and kind of like trying to steer away from being generic. Because I think after speaking to a lot of, well, I'm being a bootcamp graduate myself and like speaking to people in the area, it's like all you want to do is show that you are really good at coding. That's like the sort of like thing. It's like, oh, this is the project that I made and this is my GitHub and this kind of stuff. And it's like really being as honest as you can with yourself and like being a human being in an interview process and actually connecting with an employer. Probably will take you a lot longer to find a role, but well, maybe not. Like maybe you'll connect quicker. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, you know, we were talking to Jacob last week and he was talking about how he'd had issues with hiring and people sending in CVs that had been so chat GPT'd and very generic. And, you know, he wanted videos and video content from people. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that maybe graduates and boot campers they kind of they want to steer clear of like, oh, I used to work in another industry, or I've got these other transferable skills, or I can spot patterns in clothes design. But that's the thing that's actually going to get you hired.
That's
like
right.
To break out of that mindset a little bit.
Yeah, it's this really cool, and I don't think I don't know if it's not fully understood, but you know, I'm someone who wants to hire people that care about their job, right? Like I don't want someone whose parents did software engineering, so now I'm doing software engineering, but I don't really care. Someone once told me I was good at math, so now I'm a software engineer. That's not like the people that I distinctly look for, right? I really do think that if you're choosing to do something for your life, hopefully, if you're lucky enough, then you should really care about it, right? And so those people who might come in and try to prove how excellent they are and that they're punching right at the top, those aren't necessarily the ones that I really look for. And there's some really good examples of people who have applied for grad programs who have come from other careers, maybe are more mature people. And the key thing that they almost talk it down, like, oh, I know I did this, but I really want to get into software engineering. But the key, and I think that's what I kind of arc back to that bootcamp thing, is the fact that you've switched career. Like that takes a huge commitment to do that. So you're probably pretty sure that that's what you want to spend your time doing. So the candidate, you know, they're going to like the job because they've upped their whole career path to move that. And so I think that those people go a really long way in an organization. And when we look at when we do our grad intake, we do these kind of mob programming sessions as part of the intake. And what that really is designed for is to understand, are people confident enough to ask questions in a room of peers that they don't know the answer to, right? Yeah. And so that it's a little bit of social engineering, but the fact of it is, if I would far rather take someone who in an open room is able to be confident enough to say, sorry, I don't know why that works, than someone who's just, you know, saying all the answers and smashing it out. Because the curiosity is what carries you through your career, right? And so it's a really, really important piece of grads, but also just being a software engineer, is that curiosity that keeps you coming back for more problems, right?
Yeah, and it's so firstly, that was really well said. That's really a good way to look at it, and especially when you were talking then about how students who have like made the jump into boot camps have already changed their whole career path, so they're already part of a certain caliber. But I can't help but think about how fundamentally flawed the hiring process in general still is. You know, how, especially in many ways in web development, it's how good is your ability to like, in the pressure cooker environment of this technical interview, tell me how to solve this problem. And people who are good at that are not necessarily good at anything else that's required.
That's right. And the reality is, like, when you're on the job, there's very few moments where you have to stand up on a whiteboard and solve a technical problem, right?
Yeah. How would you solve this problem if it happened right now in a burning building?
Yeah.
I'm ready. So we're running out of time a little bit, but I think, and you've given us so much gold. I think there's so much information there that will really enthuse our listeners. But I think maybe just for the last 5 minutes or so, we could just kind of drill into like specific advice that you might give to some boot campers. So are there any common mistakes that you see newly grads make when they first apply for their roles in tech, and how they might be able to avoid those?
Yeah. I think that especially when it comes to boot camps, there is this, I don't know where it comes from, but there is this kind of, people think that because they did a boot camp, they're not as valuable, shall we say, as university graduates. That's just based on what I've kind of seen. For example, they almost use it as an excuse for why they don't know the answer to something. Or basically my advice would be, because you did a boot camp, don't see that as a disadvantage to anybody else, right? And if anything, try to use it as fuel, right? As confidence and being able to understand that dynamic that brings to you as a person. When it comes to applying for grad programs, there is that kind of piece, which is when you're going for a grad intake, understand that, for example, as I said, the business or whoever's doing that intake might be looking for particular things. And those aren't the direct reflection of you as whether you're good or not. It's whether you kind of fit the thing that they're trying to achieve at that point in time or in the future and that kind of stuff. I think one of these things is, a lot of people will apply and then kind of take knocks, right? It's a natural thing. But really, there's a lot at play when it comes to the decisions that go into kind of hiring grads. And so don't take things too personally. Ask for feedback, ask for understanding. The employer should provide that to you if they're honest and really want to help you, succeed. And so really engage with the process of that. The other little tip that I would say is if you are hiring for more than one company, people will do a blast. When it comes to talking to the company, make sure you remember who you applied to and you don't mix the names up of the companies.
Right. That sounds like it's coming from experience.
So suffice to say, lean into what you're wanting to do. Just scatter, because it'll show when you get that opportunity to talk to that company, right? So just be yourself, but be confident in your capabilities. Understand that there are expectations for grads coming in, and those expectations are not that you're able to be a senior after 6 months. If anything, they're expecting you to not produce anything necessarily in terms of code contribution to production in a good while. But what they want to do is make sure that when you're coming in, that you're able to work with the team really well, that you're able to kind of drive your own curiosity, and that you understand the environment you're going into, the business, what they're trying to solve, and you're able to kind of communicate really effectively for them.
How can our listeners learn more about the Vista Group, or maybe reach out to you for some more insights?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me on there. In terms of Vista Group, we've got vistagroup.co. There's that there. We've got our grad program as well as all listed through there, so you can always find out more about grad programs specifically. Reaching out to me, I would provide my details, but I'll probably leave it for LinkedIn is probably the easiest way for people to find me.
You're not going to give us a phone number?